Alain Deschamps had always known the land, its smells, its sounds, and its cycles. A farmer for as long as he could remember, he worked the land that his family had owned for generations in the remote foothills of the Gévaudan region in southern France. The area was as beautiful as it was eerie, a rugged land full of deep forests, high mountain ridges and dark valleys that seemed to hide untold secrets. As a child, Alain had heard the whispers, the stories passed down from old villagers, of a time long ago when something monstrous roamed these woods. The tales of the Beast of Gévaudan, a terrifying creature that had once terrorized the region, were always just that, stories. Alain had never taken them seriously. After all, that was centuries ago and the world had changed. Yet in the back of his mind, the tales always lingered like a shadow, something unexplained, something that never truly went away. At 47, Alain was a stocky, rugged man with broad shoulders from years of hard labor. His hands were calloused, rough from working the fields and tending to the animals. His face was weathered, skin tanned by years of exposure to the sun. He had the steady gaze of someone who knew the land better than anyone else, who had worked it, bled for it, and earned his living off its soil. But even Alain, with all his confidence and understanding of the land, could not shake the deep, unsettling feeling that had crept into his bones over the past few months. The first sign that something was wrong came when the cattle started acting strange. It was subtle at first, little things that Alain had shrugged off. One cow had suddenly gone missing. It wasn't unusual for the herd to wander off, but this one never returned. Then more disappeared. The sheep were no better, restless and skittish, often bleating in the dead of night as though something was prowling in the darkness. At first, Alain had thought it was a wild animal, a bear or a wolf perhaps. But he knew that something was different. The animals weren't just scared, they were terrified, and the footprints left behind were not those of any creature he had ever seen. Alain had spent countless nights patrolling his fields, his eyes constantly scanning the woods, but he never saw anything. No sign of a predator, no tracks, no evidence of the animals that were said to roam these hills. Instead, there was only the unnerving silence of the mountain, a silence that pressed in on him, heavy and suffocating. And the trees, always the trees, stretching tall and dark, their shadows long and whispering. When the weather began to shift, when the cool mountain air turned damp and the clouds gathered thick above the peaks, Alain's unease deepened. The once peaceful hills were becoming foreign, unnervingly silent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. It was the kind of stillness that gripped the soul, a silence that foretold danger. As he sat on his porch one evening, staring out across the valley, the old stories came flooding back to him. Stories his grandmother had told him in hushed tones of the Beast of Gévaudan, a creature that had plagued this land centuries ago, hunting humans with vicious cruelty. And although he had always thought of those stories as nothing more than legends, he couldn't shake the feeling that the beast was more than just a tale. The cattle were disappearing. The animals were scared. Something was stalking him, something ancient, something that shouldn't be here. That night, as Alain sat alone in his farmhouse, the wind began to howl, its mournful cry carrying through the valleys. The sound of the wind seemed to stir something deep within him, something primal that set his teeth on edge. The house groaned under the pressure of the wind as Alain took a long sip from his mug, staring out into the darkened field. The night was colder than usual, the kind of cold that crept into your bones and made you shiver no matter how warm the fire burned. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, something sharp and quick. It was the sound of something heavy, crashing through the underbrush. His heart skipped a beat. The sound was too large, too forceful to be a deer or a wild boar. Alain's hand instinctively reached for the hunting rifle that always rested near the door, and he rose slowly, his boots making a soft creak on the wooden floor. He stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin, and strained his ears to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a low growl, a guttural, menacing sound that set his hair on end. Alain's heart pounded. There was something out there, something that was no ordinary predator. The growl sent a chill down his spine as he carefully stepped into the shadows of the trees that lined his property. His grip tightened on the rifle. The land felt wrong, off balance. The shadows around him seemed to grow darker, thicker, like they were closing in. He scanned the area around him, eyes darting between the black trunks of trees, the overgrown brush. Another growl echoed through the night, closer now. Alain's breath hitched in his throat. He could feel the creature's presence, its heavy, suffocating energy surrounding him, and then, like a snap of a twig in the silence, the figure emerged. It was massive, its silhouette hulking against the moonlight that barely filtered through the branches. A creature of nightmare, taller than any man, with thick fur that rippled like a shadow across its body. Its eyes, yellow, glowing with hunger, locked onto Alain with an unnerving intensity, as if it could see straight into his soul. Alain's grip on the rifle tightened, but he couldn't bring himself to raise it. The creature moved closer, its body bristling with power, its muscles coiled like a spring. A snarl curled from its lips, revealing rows of sharp, blood-stained teeth. Alain's heart raced. This was no ordinary animal. This was the beast, the one his grandmother had warned him about, the one that had been spoken of in whispers for centuries, the Beast of Gévaudan. For a long moment, the two stared at each other, man and monster, locked in an unspoken standoff. Alain could feel his legs shaking beneath him, but he stood his ground. The beast was within striking distance, its breath ragged and hot in the cold night air. Alain knew that running would be futile. He was alone, outmatched, but he wasn't going to go down without a fight. Slowly, he raised the rifle, aiming at the creature's chest. His hands trembled, but his resolve was firm. The beast tilted its head slightly, its eyes glimmering with a sadistic curiosity, as if it could sense Alain's fear. He pulled the trigger. The shot rang out through the night, echoing across the valley, but the beast moved with blinding speed. In a flash, it leaped to the side, its agility unnatural. The bullet missed, tearing into the earth behind it. Before Alain could react, the beast was upon him, its massive form crashing into him with the force of a freight train. The rifle flew from his hands, and Alain was thrown to the ground, the wind knocked out of him. He gasped for air as the creature's hot breath washed over him, the stench of rot and decay filling his nostrils. With a swift, brutal motion, the beast's claws slashed across Alain's chest, tearing through his jacket and into his flesh. Alain cried out in pain, but the beast was relentless. It swiped again, raking its claws down his arm, and then sank its teeth into his shoulder. The pain was excruciating, a searing agony that made him scream. He tried to fight back, grabbing for anything to defend himself, but the beast was too strong, its grip unyielding. The creature growled again, this time shaking its head as it pulled its teeth from Alain's shoulder, dragging him further into the darkness. His vision blurred, his body trembling from the shock. He could feel the blood pouring from his wounds, pooling beneath him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His limbs were growing heavy, and his body was beginning to fail him. The world around him spun as the beast lifted him off the ground, its eyes still locked on his with terrifying hunger. Alain tried to scream, but no sound came. His vision darkened, the edges of the world becoming more and more distant. The beast's growl was the last thing he heard before the world went black. Alain, the farmer who had lived his entire life in the shadow of the Gévaudan mountains, had become the beast's prey. His body was left broken and torn in the woods, his lifeless form a testament to the ancient terror that still haunted the land. In the cold, unforgiving darkness of the mountain, the Beast of Gévaudan had claimed another victim. And the mountains waited, silent, once more, for the next to wander too far into the heart of the unknown.